MUFON, and this is our monthly presentation that we have. We have a guest speaker join us, and I'd like to introduce our state director, Debbie Ziegelmeyer. And Debbie, if you have anything to say, now is the time.
Now is the time. If you don't have a MADAR, go online and check into it. I'm sure, Margie, you have the information too, don't you, on how to get a MADAR. MADAR is a device that is hooked to our Ethernet. And this gentleman's been working on this project since the 70s, but I forgot how many he's got across the United States and across the world, but they do detect EMF. It's a great project. If you look on National UFO Recording Center, and on MUFON, they document, and we've been able to correlate cases, sighting cases, along with MADAR hits. So read it, go online, look at it. It's a really good project to get involved in. We got a lot going on in Missouri, and someday we'll let you know how much. We're active as always, so I'm not going to take up Kathy's time with that because this state is popping. We're working on a lot of cases here, a lot going on.
And actually, we're going to be participating in World UFO Day on July 2nd. Missouri MUFON is going to have an open meeting that is free to anyone who wants to join. We're going to discuss MUFON in general and specifically Missouri MUFON from 7 to 9 p.m. And then we're going to do a Skywatch after that. So mark your calendars for that and also watch our newsletter. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Kathleen Marden is the niece of Betty and Barney Hill, and she is the foremost authority on their case. I'm sure that everybody is familiar with the case, but there is some new information that she has about this, and we're looking forward to hearing all about that. And welcome to our MUFON meeting today, Kathy.
Thank you very much.
Welcome, Kathy. Thank you, Kathy. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'll bring up the presentation now and go to the slideshow. Okay, so this is the 60th anniversary year of Betty's and Barney's UFO abduction back in 1961. And here are Betty and Barney on the left. That photograph was taken when The Interrupted Journey was written. So it was about 1966.
Kathy, we can't see your presentation.
Yes.
Did you hit share screen and then click on that particular window?
I think I forgot to.
Now we see your whole, okay. There we go.
Okay, so this is the 60th anniversary year of Betty and Barney Hill's UFO abduction, and I was 13 when it occurred. My mother was the first person that Betty called. Here are Betty and Barney up on the left with the dog Delcy, a little dachshund, who was with them when they had their UFO experience. In the center is my painting of what their entity looked like based upon my observation of one of these time and time again throughout my lifetime. And on the right is the 60th anniversary version of Captured. I've updated it. It has some new photographs, and it has a new section on Stanton Friedman that I wrote, and a new section on the evidence. There's been new evidence since we wrote the first book. So on the left, you see Betty puffing on a cigarette. She died from lung cancer. Then I'm the baby in the center. And I believe that might be Betty's oldest daughter on the right. And then me. I put that picture there because Betty and Barney would never have had this experience the way they did unless I had gone to Niagara Falls. I went to Niagara Falls a month or two earlier, and I had photographs. And this was me when I was 13 years old, and I had such a wonderful time. Barney asked Betty, when I was showing them the photographs, if she'd ever been. And she said, no, she had not. So Barney asked her if she would like to go. And she said that she would sometime. Well, she had a vacation from her job as a social worker in September, and Barney decided to surprise her with the trip. Here is my mother, Janet Miller, and she's holding Betty, her older sister. Betty was 10 years older than my mother. And this is out in front of my grandparents' house. I grew up across the street from my grandparents. And on that day, September 20th, 1961, when I arrived home from school, Betty was on the telephone with my mother. She was very concerned that the craft had come so close to her and Barney the night before that they might have been contaminated. She wanted my mother to phone a physicist who lived in our neighborhood and to ask for his advice. For some reason, when he finally did call back that same late afternoon, he told Betty if she had a compass, she should take it to the car to see how the needle would react. Well, we know that that's not going to measure radiation. It's going to measure a magnetic field. And so, as you know, in other MUFON cases, the same evidence has been left behind. And in the Reed case, on the trunk of the vehicle. So that was the same day that my mother told me that she had had a UFO sighting in 1958. It's the first time I'd ever heard about flying saucers. And she said it was large and cigar-shaped, and that there were smaller ones flying around it. And so she and another aunt had gone out grocery shopping. They always went on Friday evening. And my mother stopped the car, ran to a house. They knew the people who lived there, and they observed that craft too. And John Fuller wrote about it in the book Incident at Exeter. So this is what Betty and Barney knew on September 20th, 1961. And the abduction occurred in the early morning hours. We're going to start with the night of September 19th. This is when Betty and Barney went through Montreal, stopped for the night, 112 miles west of Montreal, had a wonderful afternoon being tourists in Montreal, and then were looking for a motel on the outskirts of the city. They wanted to stay downtown, but their dog was with them, and they had to go to a motel. But on the way, Barney got lost and ended up on the road that would take them back to New Hampshire. I've driven this entire route with my husband on the same roads in the same time frame. So it was really a wonderful experience to know precisely what happened to them. And the reason I decided to do it is that Robert Schaefer, who is one of the disinformants involved in this case, said that Betty and Barney had been driving so long that day that they were hallucinating when they saw the craft. Well, my husband and I were about 20 years older than Betty and Barney when we did it, and we weren't hallucinating, I have to tell you. But Betty and Barney, when they entered New Hampshire, stopped at Colebrook and had some cup of coffee and a little snack, and then filled up the car with gas and proceeded down the highway. They reached Lancaster, New Hampshire at about 10:55 p.m. And just south of Lancaster, Betty saw a new light in the sky. But what attracted her attention was that it flew upward. She thought it might be a meteorite, but it didn't fly like a meteorite. So she was curious about what that was. They drove south. It was a bright light night. The moon was 3/4 full. And at 11:15, she convinced Barney to stop at the Mount Cleveland picnic area. And this is just south of Twin Mountain. So he didn't want to stop. He said, "Oh, Betty, let's just get going. Let's get home." And Betty said, "Well, we need to walk Delcy, the dog." So they got out. Barney got the leash. He walked Delcy. First, he went to the trunk of the car and removed Betty's pistol that he had put into the trunk of the car. He took that pistol not because he was afraid of this craft. Barney was a confirmed skeptic. He took it because there were bears in the area. This was a picnic area and they might be coming out of the woods. He took the pistol so he could fire it into the air if bears came out so that he could scare them away from himself and the dog. Betty took the binoculars and she looked up at this craft. And then Barney came back with the dog and he looked through the binoculars. He knew that this was unusual, but he got back into the car and he said to Betty, "Oh, it's just a commercial plane or a Piper Cub or something like that. Just forget about it. Let's get going." So just south of the Twin Mountain in the picnic area is Cannon Mountain. They arrived there at about 11:30. And Cannon Mountain is a ski area. You can see the ski slopes. This is the old Route 3 they were traveling on. So this is the view that they had when they came down this street. And up here is a little ski lodge. And there, it was lighted. The lights were on inside it. And when this craft passed over the top of it, the light blinked out. This over here is Route 93 that travels north now. Wasn't there in 1961. So at about 11:35, it's just south of Cannon Mountain, they stopped at the Old Man of the Mountain for another look. The old man fell off the mountain. You can see his profile here in 2003. They got out of the car, they used the binoculars, they looked at this craft. It was next to the old man's profile. It appeared to be rotating. It appeared to be lighted on only one side. And they said that it was 1.5 to 2 times the length of the profile. The old man's profile is 48 feet from forehead to chin. They got back into the car and headed south. So they exited Franconia Notch in Lincoln, New Hampshire. It was North Lincoln. And this is the area where the cabins and the motels started, where there were tourist attractions. And but it was the off season, so there wasn't a lot of activity. But they were traveling south and in North Lincoln when suddenly this craft swooped down. And Betty was saying to Barney, "You have to stop the car. You have to pull over and find a place to look at this." But before he could stop the car, this craft came down and hovered right over the road, extending onto their side of the road and beyond that. And Barney had to stop the car right in the middle of the road so that he wouldn't be directly underneath that craft. He stepped out of the car for a better look with his binoculars, and then he stepped back. The craft was now about 100 feet above the car as it descended. It was originally stopped at about 200 feet. And Barney stepped away from the car. And when he did, the craft shifted to the adjacent field. And this is the field back in that time frame. And he looked up at this craft and he could see figures dressed in shiny black uniforms looking back at him. And then little red lights started to slide out after most of these little ones had gone to the back of this craft. There was like a corridor that encircled the craft here. There were bright lights shining out, and one remained at the window. The artist wasn't able to fit that in. But then Barney saw something dropping down from underneath the craft. And from the look on that leader's face, he was scared to death. In fact, he said that he thought that he was going to be captured like, quote, a bug in a net. And that's when he knew that he had to get out of there and fast, or he was going to be captured. What you can see here is Barney's sketch that he drew on September 20th, 1961, as soon as he arrived home. This is what it looked like. So this is what he remembered. He went dashing for the car, screaming to Betty that they had to get out of there or they were going to be captured. And he'd left the car running, the door open. He ran, he got inside the car, and he started speeding down Route 3. He said to Betty, "Roll down the window and see if you can see that craft." She was expecting to see the lights. She rolled down the window. All she saw was blackness. She didn't see the stars or the moon or the lights. And she said to Barney, "I think it's gone." So as he's speeding down, within moments, they hear code-like buzzing sounds. Beep, 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 that were striking the trunk of the vehicle. It caused their car to vibrate and for a tingling sensation to pass through their bodies. The next thing they remembered was they were in a new location, 35 miles south of where they had been previously. They had some memories, but not many. They remembered finding themselves on a dirt road. They remembered a fiery orb and a roadblock. Betty turned to Barney and said, "Barney, now do you believe in flying saucers?" And he said, "Oh, Betty, don't be ridiculous. Of course not." And he said, "I can show you that I can produce those buzzing sounds with this car," because they had a second series of buzzing sounds. And so he stopped the car. He drove up from one side of the road to the other, did everything he could to produce those buzzing sounds, but he couldn't. This is the route that they took that night. Here was the coffee shop they stopped at in Colebrook. Here is Lancaster, where they had the first sighting. This was the first stop, just south of Twin Mountain. This is the close encounter field right here. The abduction occurred here. And this was the new location they found themselves in, 35 miles south of their previous point, which was the close encounter field from their conscious recall. And they arrived home at 5:15 a.m. That was 7 hours to drive 190 miles, although Barney stated that he was driving 50 miles an hour, sometimes 55, because it was a bright light night. So, and no one else was on the road, not many people at least, so he was exceeding the speed limit. This is where they lived, and I know for a fact, I think that it was 5:15 because I have the watch that Betty was wearing. And I had never noticed the time that that watch said, but I just did a show at the University of New Hampshire with Ben Hansen for a travel channel show where actually MUFON did a DNA analysis on a spot on Betty's dress. But as we were looking at all of the evidence, Ben picked up Betty's watch and said, 5:15. He notices things that I don't notice. So that was interesting to see that. I knew that she walked into the house and neither her watch nor Barney's watch was working. They just thought that even though they wound it at 10:05 that night and reset it, that it was, it had run down. Both had run down. So they set the time of their arrival. They wound their watches and neither watch ever worked again. So now I'm going to get into the Project Blue Book report. When Betty phoned my mother another time, she phoned several times that afternoon, my father's best friend was at the house. He stopped by every night on his way home from work. He worked days as a machinist, and he had been the chief of police in the small town of Newton, New Hampshire. Very tiny town, part-time police force. And what he said, his name was Buzz Sawyer. And what Buzz said is that Betty and Barney should report their sighting to Pease Air Force Base because Pease contacted the police stations and told them that if anyone reported a UFO, then they should advise that person to file a report with Pease. So here are some of the things that I think are important in that Project Blue Book report. When it seemed to be a matter of hundreds of feet above their automobile, it would be about the size of a dinner plate at arm's length. It stopped and hovered in the air. While hovering, objects began to appear from the body of the object. The flight was described as jerky, not smooth. When they arrived in the vicinity of Ashland, New Hampshire, they again heard the buzzing sound of the object. However, they did not see it at this time. Mr. Hill stated, inasmuch as he and his wife did in fact see this occurrence, he decided to report it. Well, Project Blue Book initially decided that they would identify it as an advertising searchlight. An advertising searchlight in a desolate area of New Hampshire during the off-season. It wasn't the way it is now. Now it's busy, but it wasn't in 1961. Also, Project Blue Book said that the flight pattern, the report said the flight pattern of the vehicle was erratic. It ascended and descended rapidly. It swooped down. But the revised Blue Book report said there was no lateral or vertical movement noted. They said there was no evidence presented to indicate the object was due to other than natural causes. And it was probably an advertising searchlight or the planet Jupiter as the result of a strong temperature inversion. Well, I investigated these things myself. And when I was doing my investigation for Captured, I investigated it for, well, we published the book in 2007 and I began my investigation in 1990. So it was a very long-term investigation. And in all, I not only investigated, I did all the research I could. I interviewed the original investigators who were still alive. I had all of Betty's files and the abduction tapes that I transcribed for comparative analysis. I wanted to know if there was a strong temperature inversion that night. I knew it couldn't possibly have been an advertising searchlight of the planet Jupiter. And the fact of the case is that I asked a veteran meteorologist if he would look into the National Weather Archives for me. And he did. And then just to check his results, he asked two of his colleagues to do it as well, to make sure that he wasn't misreading it or had the wrong date or whatever. And this is the report that was sent back. It said the light east airflow that night would have caused subsidence warming, just the opposite of an inversion as claimed by the Air Force. That was pretty typical in those days. If you've studied the history of government involvement in UFOs, and I have extensively when Stanton and I were writing fact fiction and flying saucers. I went to archival collections as well, and that's when I really had an eye-opener. So in 1974, there was an investigation by two Air Force officers at Maxwell Air Force Base at the Command and Staff College. They wrote a thesis for their master's degree. And in that thesis, they asked, should Project Blue Book be reopened? And here are some excerpts from that. You can find the entire thing online if you look for it. At least it was when I last looked. The Air Force's official explanation turned out to be, quote, almost as erratic as the radar and visual sightings themselves. Blue Book's inversion explanation could not be supported. No attempt was made at drawing a possible correlation between the visual and radar UFO reports in the North Concord, Vermont Air Force Station and the Pease Air Force Base Precision Approach Radar, even though former Project Blue Book director, Captain E.J. Ruppelt, admitted as early as January 24, 1953, that visual reports that supposedly correlate with erratic radar tracks warrant a detailed investigation. There's much more in their report. It also said that when this was released to the public, their story was released to the public, the Pentagon contacted Wright-Patterson and asked for the Hills Project Blue Book files to be sent to them. So this is NICAP's investigation, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Well, on September 26, not long after Betty and Barney arrived home from their trip, she wrote a letter. The reason she found the address and the request for this is she knew nothing about UFOs. She'd never read a book on the topic, despite what the disinformants said. And so she went to the Portsmouth Public Library and took out her first book on the topic. It was written by Donald Kehoe, former Major Donald Kehoe, who was the NICAP director at that time. And you can see here that she talks about the erratic flight pattern of the craft. And I'm going to show you another part of what she wrote that is, I think, is very important. As it glided closer, he was able to see inside the object, but not too closely. He did see many figures scurrying about as though they were making some hurried type of preparation. One figure was observing us from the windows. From the distance this was seen, the figures appeared to be about the size of a pencil and seemed to be dressed in some type of shiny black uniform. At this point, my husband became shocked and got back in the car in a hysterical condition, laughing and repeating that they were going to capture us. He started driving the car. The motor had been left running, and as we started to move, we heard several buzzing or beeping sounds, which seemed to be striking the trunk of the car. Then, 10 days after the incident occurred, Betty started to have a series of dreams. She had them just before she woke up in the morning. And I had been looking for years for information on the dreams that people have just prior to waking up in the morning. And I finally received my answer. And that is these dreams in this kind of hypnotic state, a hypnopompic state, often combine information that really occurred in your life with fantasy to attempt to come to terms with what anxiety you're having that you are attempting to work out. So her dreams did begin with conscious recall, she told me. Their car was surrounded. They're walked to the craft and taken to examining rooms. A pleasant man speaks with them in English with a strong accent, and they undergo examinations, see the star map, a book, and they're escorted back to the car. The star map is like a 1961 classroom chart that you just pull down like a window shade. This is what Betty dreamed about, these entities that looked pretty human, only they had bluish lips. They were wearing caps, blue cadets type caps, and a blue cadet uniform. That's not what they saw and remembered under hypnosis. Walter Webb was assigned by Major Kehoe to investigate the case. And so he, in early October, interviewed Betty and Barney. He went to their house and spent about 6 hours interviewing them separately and then together. He wrote a confidential report because Betty and Barney never intended to have this released to the public. Walter, in addition to being a NICAP investigator, was an astronomer, and he worked at the Hayden Planetarium in Boston. And when Alan Hynek was at the Smithsonian Astrophysics Laboratory, when he worked on the satellite tracking system, Walter Webb worked on that satellite tracking system with him. So Barney, as I said, worked for the US Post Office. And this is part of his report that I think is very important. The approaching UFO finally filled up the entire field of the binoculars. The leader at the window held a special attraction for the witness and frightened him terribly. The witness said he could almost feel this figure's intense concentration to do something, to carry out a plan. Mr. Hill believed that he was going to be captured, quote, like a bug in a net, close quote. And that is when he knew it was no conventional aircraft he was observing, but something alien and unearthly, containing beings of a superior type, beings that were somehow not human. He wrote his confidential report on October 26th, a couple of weeks after he interviewed Betty and Barney. So as time went on, Barney wanted to forget about the whole thing. Before Betty called my mother, Barney said to her, "Let's not tell anyone about what we saw. No good can ever come of this." But Betty wouldn't leave it alone. Whenever she came down to my childhood home, well, they came at least once a week, she would talk and talk and talk about that. She was obsessed with it. She wanted to know what happened. And Barney would just leave. He'd walk on the backlands of the farm. This was bothering him so badly. And finally, he developed post-traumatic stress disorder and conversion hysteria, in which a he had psychosomatic symptoms. It was psychogenically induced because of that incident in the mountains that bothered him so greatly. He ended up developing bleeding ulcers and had to be hospitalized. He had to take 3 months off from work because of that. And he was finally referred to Dr. Benjamin Simon. This is Ben Simon. He saw them for the first time in December of 1963, and he hypnotized them beginning in February of 1964. He spent a month just interviewing them and conditioning them to go into deep trance hypnosis. That was a specialty of his. So he hypnotized them separately, and he reinstated amnesia at the end of each session. He did hypnoanalysis for Barney. He was the patient, really. He did hypnotherapy with Betty because she did not have the trauma that Barney had, or at least not that level. Here is Dr. Simon's obituary. He was a very important neuropsychiatrist. During World War II, he set up the psychiatric unit at the Mason General Hospital. He was a colonel in the Army at that time, and he was awarded the Army Commendation Medal and the American Campaign Medal and the Victory Medal for his work with soldiers coming back from the war front who had physiological symptoms that were psychogenically induced. And where other psychiatrists could not heal these men, Dr. Simon had developed a special technique, a special method of deep trance hypnosis where he probed deep enough to get to the crux of the matter. Let me give you an example. In the movie Let There Be Light that was made about his work, it was a John Huston movie, you'll see a veteran who is wheeled into his office. This man cannot see, but his eyes are not injured. The other psychiatrist and Dr. Simon first probed on what caused the blindness. And he had seen his friend killed in front of him. And that when they told them he could see again, he couldn't see again. So Dr. Simon probed deeper. And what he discovered was that a couple of weeks before this happened, this soldier had received a Dear John letter from his sweetheart. She was breaking up with him. And it was the combination of these things that caused this soldier's blindness. After Dr. Simon worked through this under hypnosis with this soldier and did therapy, he could see again. And at the end of the movie, you saw him batting a ball, running along the bases, and then you saw him boarding the bus to go home to his family. So Dr. Simon taught at Yale, he lectured at Harvard. He set up, I already said that. He was the past president of the American Psychiatric Hospitals, Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, etc. He held a lot of high positions. He's in Who's Who in America. So in hypnosis, he didn't start with Betty and Barney's amnesia. He started with the beginning of their trip out to Niagara Falls, why they decided to go, how they packed, what they took with them. And then he took them along every bit of their route and their stops. And it was great to have all of those hypnosis tapes, because when I made that trip, I had memorized most of the tapes by that time. So I was looking at the sites that they were seeing. And so finally, I've already been through what Betty and Barney remembered. And now I'm going to get into what was revealed through hypnosis. Well, Barney did have a breakthrough memory before this hypnosis session. He was visiting my family's home, and we were trying to help him overcome this block that he had. And he did overcome it, and with a great release of emotion, he was panicky, and he said, there were men in the road and they don't walk like us. And he said, and one of them was holding some kind of light in his hand. And that's what he remembered. Well, when he went to Dr. Simon, Dr. Simon pushed him to go beyond that time in the field into these memories. And Barney had the one major reaction, a great release of emotion, where he was so frightened. If you've ever listened to what there is of the hypnosis tapes on YouTube, that was essentially the only time that Barney had this release of emotion, but I think that it helped him. But they did remember driving up, there were these figures, 6 figures standing in the road, and the car stalled. It was different from what Betty wrote in her dreams. In her dreams, she said there were 8 to 11 figures standing in the road and that they surrounded the car. Under hypnosis, she and Barney were having a conversation about the men in the road. Was there an accident ahead? And Barney said to Betty, it's the ones that I saw in the field. And Betty, the motor of the car died. Betty panicked. She tried to escape from the car. They divided in 2 groups of 3. They didn't surround the car. 3 went to Betty's door, 3 went to Barney's door. And they removed Betty and Barney from the vehicle. Barney went willingly. He did have his gun still on the seat of the car, but he left it there because he was afraid that he would be harmed if, in fact, he attempted to fight off these beings. This is an excerpt from the hypnosis tape on what he told Dr. Simon about being escorted down this path through the woods at the abduction site. He said, I felt very weak, but I wasn't afraid, and I can't even think. I am not bewildered. I can't even think of questioning what is happening to me, and I'm being assisted. I think my feet are dragging. I think I'm going up a slight incline and my feet are not bumping on the rocks. That's funny. I thought of my feet bumping on the rocks and they are going up smoothly. Well, as you can see, here are Barney. They're not Barney's shoes. These are my husband's and I put these marks on them. But if you know anything about this case, you have heard about Barney's best dress shoes being ruined. They were so deeply scraped that he had to buy new shoes. And when they took Betty up to go up the ramp, she fought for her life. She didn't know if she was going to ever see her family again, if she'd be returned. They had been reassuring her that she wouldn't be harmed, that they only needed to do a few simple tests and then they would be returned to their car and on their way home. But she didn't believe them. And she fought for her life. And in the process of doing that, she tore her dress from waist to hemline and tore the hem down on one side. And someone unfortunately cut that tear out. So what Betty said to Dr. Simon is, we get to the arc, she called it an arc, and I don't want to go on. And so the man behind me says to go on, and he's a little angry with me. So I go on. That's after she fought him. The longer you stand there fooling around, the longer it's going to take. So why don't you just go on and get it over with and get back to your car? We haven't got much time either. So that's what Betty told Dr. Simon under hypnosis. And under hypnosis, you don't say every single thing that goes through your mind. You leave out information. You leave out some details as you're moving along. And Betty was really rushed. She wanted to get along and through the hypnosis. So anyway, she was taken into a darkened hallway. There were 2 sizes of beings in that hallway. And the one that she called the leader, who was taller than the other ones, took her into this examining room. First she went onto like a dentist chair, very modern looking, kind of laid back, and they examined her skeletal system, her nervous system, her muscular system, very interested in her hands, her feet, her joints, looked into her mouth, her eyes, her ears, took samples, and then they told her to go over to the examining table they escorted her there. There was the one that she called the examiner in the room. And he tried first to remove her dress, breaking the zipper. In the process, he tore the stitching for about 2 inches at the top of the zipper that ran down the back of her dress, and the thick zipper fabric about 1 inch down. And after she had to help them, assist them, to teach them how to unzip a zipper. And then they put her on the table, and the examiner produced a large needle. And she said, "What are you going to do with that?" And he said, "It's only a simple test. We're just going to insert it in your navel." And all of this conversation, by the way, was telepathic from them to Betty. And he said, and she said, "Don't do it. It will hurt." And he said, "It won't hurt. It's only a simple pregnancy, like a pregnancy test." And so she still said, "No, don't do it." And he plunged that needle into her navel, causing such pain that Dr. Simon had to end the session early. But before he ended it, the leader did something by her head and removed all the pain she was experiencing. And I have worked with so many other experiencers where this has happened to them too, whether or not they knew about Betty and Barney or all the details of their case. The examiner then left the room, and he went into Barney's examining room. There was only one on the craft, but they were set up to do these experiments. They had been doing them for a long time before they took Betty and Barney for the first time. I've worked with experiencers who are generational experiences, who had their first experience in the early 50s, and it was an abduction, not contact with benevolent space brothers, and their mothers as well. So this goes back a few generations. So they did the same kind of test with Barney that they did with Betty. And they took a sperm sample from Barney as well. Well, Betty dressed herself again and started looking around the room, and she found what she called a book. I think of it today as a tablet. It resembled a thin, stiff, shiny plastic with printing under it. And it was an inch or less thick. And it had a dark, stiff cover that was not thick, it was thin. But it was stiff. And there were 6 columns. And in the year 2000, during my investigation, I asked Betty to sketch what she remembered. And she took a few days to remember all of it, but she went back into the banks of her memory and came up with these sketches. Also was a star map. After she said to the leader, "Can I take this book with me as my evidence?" And he said, "Yes, you can." And then she said, "I know you're not from around here. Where's your home port?" And so he, under hypnosis, did not pull a map down from the wall. He did something, and it produced this 3-dimensional star map. She said at one time that it was like looking out a window at the stars, and that to Marjorie Fish, Marjorie wanted to know, she was the one who did the star map research, if maybe it could have been a holographic image. And Betty said, well, it could have been. It was 3-dimensional. So anyway, the leader showed her this, that these were the trade routes. And so this, and this, where the solid lines are. And then there were other lines that were dotted, that were connected to other stars. And Betty did go home and as the result of Dr. Simon's post-hypnotic suggestion, and she did draw this sketch. So let's jump ahead now to as they were leaving the craft. They were going to escort both of them out to the car together, but Betty was angry when the smaller ones who act as the guards saw that she was carrying that book, and they won't let anyone leave that craft with anything that belongs to them. And so they took the book from her, and she was hopping mad, and she stayed behind arguing. She wanted that book as her proof. She was promised that she could take it with her. And so Barney was escorted alone down to the car. That's not the way it happened in Betty's dreams. They went down together in Betty's dreams. Barney was put into the driver's seat of the car where he sat on his gun. He's lucky it didn't fire. And then Betty came down after, and on her way down, she said to the examiner, do you think that you could come back? Because I know other people who have a lot more knowledge than I have, and they might be able to speak with you. And he said, well, maybe we can come back, but I'm not certain. It's not my decision to make. So it shows that he was under orders from someone else, even though he was a leader on that craft. And so Betty said, well, how would you find me? Out of all the millions of people on this planet, how would you find me? And he said, we can always find those we're looking for. So again, Barney said, I did not feel I'd been kidnapped. I think of kidnapping when you're being harmed. And I know this has been played up over and over again for movies and television as being something that was really awful that happened to Betty and Barney. But these are their statements. These are quotes from them. Betty said, I hope that somehow we would meet again. Maybe he would come back and meet people who could answer his questions. He said he would try. That Dr. Simon hypnotized them and took them back to the same questions at different hypnosis sessions. So they went through the entire sighting and abduction at least twice with him separately. And so then Betty and Barney first they watched the craft kind of roll. It turned a bright red orange and flew up into the sky. That's their memory of it. I'm wondering if they saw that at the beginning and not at the end, but I'm not certain about that. They did find themselves back on Route 3, the highway they were traveling on, and they heard a second series of buzzing sounds. They looked for the craft, but this time they didn't see it. And Betty said, I'm just so happy the whole thing happened. And I said to Barney, well, Barney, come on, try to tell me now that you don't believe in flying saucers. And Barney said, oh, don't be ridiculous. And Betty said, I think that he's joking, but I'm not sure. Then all of a sudden we get the beep, 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 beep on the trunk of the car again. And that's when Barney said, I can produce those sounds, which he couldn't produce. So under hypnosis, this is Betty's dream alien, and this is what she and Barney remembered. After the hypnosis sessions, they tried to refocus their lives. They became very politically active. They had already started this during the hypnosis sessions and before, but they took all of this on with new vigor because they were going to put their experience behind them now. They were not going to speak about this again. And so they worked on Lyndon Johnson's presidential campaign. And I did as well. The three of us went to his inauguration. This is my invitation. Here's Barney, who was a delegate, Betty. This is the New Hampshire delegation. And here I am, right here in the back. Barney also was awarded for his work in the community and the state. He set up the Rockingham County Community Action Program with a group of volunteers, and with funding through the Office of Economic Opportunity, the federal office, federal funds, through Sergeant Shriver, who was the head of that at that time. And so he was awarded a certificate of commendation for doing this from the governor of New Hampshire, John King, and Sergeant Shriver and Charles Whitmore from the New Hampshire Economic Opportunity Office. And he was also appointed to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission as on the State Advisory Committee. So these were very big positions that Barney was filling. He was becoming well known around the state, as was Betty, for the good work they were doing. They worked on a literacy program because there was a literacy test to vote in those days. And so they were doing that as well. But they weren't talking about UFOs. That's what the disinformants won't tell you. They'll tell you that Barney was a weak man who would do and think anything that Betty told him. Valerie Cunningham, who is an African-American historian who knew Barney, said, quote, "Barney was fearless and outspoken." Dr. Simon told Betty and Barney that if their memories under hypnosis were correct and real, then they would find the abduction site. They remembered it, and they looked for it starting in September of, in October or November of 1961, and they continued to look. But under hypnosis, they really had a very good memory. And on Labor Day weekend of 1965, the family was camping up in that area. Betty and Barney were there, my grandparents, and my mother and I were there. My father was a Boy Scout leader, and so he took my brothers and the Boy Scout troop on a camp out, and they were not with us. But Barney, for some reason, turned onto the correct road, found that road, and just automatically turned there. And this is where the non-human entities were standing, and this is the path through the woods that they were taken to. This is an aerial view. Now, Betty and Barney thought that they drove down this dirt road and that this is where the entities were standing, and this was the path through the woods. The craft had landed back here, and then they were taken back this way. There's an embankment here, so it would have been a lot more difficult for them to return, to be taken up that way. I'm not certain because their car was facing in the right direction from what they remember. But I'm wondering how much of human logic they put into all of this too. I'm wondering, I just wonder if that magnetic field around the trunk of the car means that car was picked up and carried. Well, anyway, here is the abduction site. Betty's standing on it. You can see they always remembered beach sand, and it looks like beach sand there. There's a housing development there now. The road has been paved. It's a house that sits on that site, unfortunately. At least I have photographs. And then in 1965, there was a violation of confidentiality that changed Betty's and Barney's lives. John Luttrell wrote to them in September of 1965. And he said, meanwhile, I've been talking to Laurie D'Alessandro in Weymouth, and if the hills prove to be anywhere near as nice as she describes, meeting both of you will indeed be a pleasure. She thinks exceptionally highly of you, and she too agrees that your experience is perhaps one of the most significant ever to occur. He said, if I'm welcome, would either of you kindly call Collect anytime? And he said, rest assured, my motives lie only in the realm of information. I have no intention of commercializing upon what's happened to the hills. Well, unfortunately, he did arrive at their house, but they had forewarning that he was coming, and they left the house. I remember that night. They were at my grandparents' house, and I grew up across the street. And so I was with them the night when they were hiding out from John Luttrell. They begged him not to write anything. They wanted this to remain confidential. They could lose their jobs. Barney could lose his positions, all the good things that he was doing in the state of New Hampshire that he loved so much. But in October, and for 5 nights, October 26th was the first one, it was published in the Boston Traveler, and that was the newspaper that he wrote for. We met as a family at that point, and we discussed what to do now, because that was a huge story. No case of alien abduction had ever been investigated besides theirs in that time frame. And so we decided as a family, because it had an impact on all of us, not just Betty and Barney. And we thought that since this had already traveled around the United States and was going around the world, that they should talk about this. And so they decided to do the first lecture. It was set up through the public information officer at Pease Air Force Base. It was held in early November of 1965. And it was at the Unitarian Church in Dover, New Hampshire. It was a night when it was sleeting. The church was full. The basement of the church was full. Many of Betty's and Barney's friends were there. Admiral Knowles, who was a retired Navy Rear Admiral. John Fuller, who ended up writing The Interrupted Journey, was there. Many others were there. Ben Sweat, who was an Air Force officer, who was a good friend of theirs. And so they did speak. They didn't speak about the abduction. They were introduced by the public information officer from Pease Air Force Base, who talked about how they were receiving Project Blue Book reports. And so that's their first lecture. They had spoken to their church group prior to that, to the couples club, but that was it. And that was certainly not going to go out over the airwaves. They then later agreed to permit John Fuller to write The Interrupted Journey, only if Dr. Simon would cooperate as well. The Interrupted Journey, I have learned through my investigation, is not completely accurate. There's the letter in John Fuller's collection, his archival collection in the University of Boston University. At Boston University. Stanton and I visited there together, and we found that letter. And his publisher was telling him that he was not going to have a book unless he spiced up this story. He had to build intrigue into it. He had to fictionalize it. It was not going to be okay if Barney took the gun out of the trunk of the car because he was walking the dog in a section where there were bears. John Fuller had to write that he took a tire jack out of the car when he got out of the car when he was stopped by the craft that was hovering overhead. So that's just one example. There were several examples of how this book is fictionalized. But it was publicized in Look magazine for two months. This is the October 4th, 1966 issue. And there was another one in September, I believe it was. And the book became an international bestseller. It was a New York Times bestseller, and it was published in several languages. The movie, let me get to this first. Look magazine covered my high school graduation as part of this story that John Fuller was writing. And this is Look magazine's photographer, Paul Fusco. And here I am in my graduating from high school. And here's Betty, and here's Barney. And that's my younger brother right there. You can just see the top of his head. We went back to my grandparents' house after that and had a cookout, but I wasn't allowed to take any friends with me because Look magazine had to photograph this. I was disappointed. And then the movie UFO Incident was made for television movie in 1975. They hoped it would be a major motion picture, but it was the movie of the week. And starring James Earl Jones, one of his first roles as an actor, and Estelle Parsons. It followed the interrupted journey, not what Captured follows. The real story is in Captured. And I do have an option on Captured that was taken out by Bryce Zabel, who is working, a Hollywood producer, who's working on doing a movie of some type on it, or a television series or documentary or something. So this is out of order, unfortunately. I just put this together and I didn't notice it. Oh, no, it's not. It is evidence. Okay, it's evidence. In 1976, Stanton Friedman wrote to John Luttrell and asked him if he had ever spoken with anyone else who had observed the UFO that Betty and Barney saw on that night. And John wrote back and he said, in conclusion, Mr. Friedman, people from different communities I recall interviewing between 12 and 14 different people from different communities surrounding Franconia Notch, New Hampshire, none of whom knew one another, but all of whom remembered experiencing the same sighting at the same time the Hills did in the same location. This was basically established by drawing comparable lines of sightings on an area map, and all intersected at precisely the same location reported by Mr. and Mrs. Hill. This is the best I have to offer, and while I have every desire to cooperate, I am likewise insistent that my name not be published by you or any other person who could draw me back into this situation, even as much as by inference. I now feel that I have done everything possible within my limits and my memory to be of help with you. This is his one redeeming quality as far as I'm concerned, because he did find witnesses that further backed up Betty's and Barney's story. But I find it ironic that he took their story to the public against Betty's and Barney's wishes, but he would not let Stanton Friedman use his statement, which, and Stanton was ethical enough that he would not disclose that. And it's actually being disclosed for the first time in my new section that I wrote in Captured. So this is one of the new pieces of evidence that we have now that we can release. So the scientific investigation of the evidence came next. So on the star map, on the symbols, and on Betty's dress. So when John Fuller's book was published, Marjorie Fish read it. And she was a member of APRO and an amateur astronomer. She was also a school teacher in Ohio. And she thought that if this place existed in our local galactic neighborhood, out 54 light years, she would be able to find it. And she thought it would probably be easy to find a match. So she started going to the university. Remember, there were no computers, and she couldn't take the astronomical catalogs out of the university. She had to sit and she had to copy by hand all the distance data and the characteristics of all of these stars. In one of her maps, she had 256 beads of different sizes and colors in this three-dimensional frame. And imagine the math she had to do to build these frames. In all, she built 14. And 4 years later, she still didn't have a match. But finally, she went back to the university and found that a new catalog had been released with more accurate distance data. It was a Gliese catalog. And she copied the new distance data down. She went back and she rearranged the stars in the proper model, because she had built models out in all directions from the sun, not just one direction. And so she rearranged those with the new distance data. And she discovered that there were 3 stars that were not on the map prior to this. They were thought to be further in the distance. So she did this and she had a match. The greatest problem she had then was in finding scientists who would vet her work for accuracy. And so Coral Lorenzen Coral was the co-director of APRO. And she contacted Stanton Friedman, and Stanton was doing some lectures at that time. He was about to give up his full-time job as a nuclear physicist to bill himself as the flying saucer physicist and speak at colleges around the country. So he did meet with Marjorie at Coral's request when he was in Ohio to do a lecture. And he told me that he felt that Marjorie was much better suited to speak with scientists than with the general population. She was brilliant, and she was accurate and methodical and patient to have worked on this for all of those years. So he, after speaking with her and seeing her work, was willing to find scientists. Alan Hynek was one of them. A statistician was one of them as well. And that was David Saunders from the Condon Project. He was one of the primary investigators for the Condon Project, but he was thrown off for insubordination when he found the trick letter in the files at the Condon Project. But he was a statistician, so he looked at this. And then when computers were finally in the university, Ohio State University professor also had his class do a computer model of Betty's map. And all agreed that Marjorie's work was accurate. Then Stanton published on Marjorie's work, and he convinced Terence Dickinson, who was an astronomer who wrote for Astronomy magazine, to write an article about it, which he did. And then he published a shiny version of that, a small booklet as well. And it attracted a lot of attention from scientists. And many scientists were convinced by Terry Dickinson's work, along with the other scientists, that Betty was abducted based upon this, because there was something special about the stars on Betty's map. All of the pattern stars on Betty's map are sun-like, though only 5% of the 1,000 stars in our local galactic neighborhood out 54 years are sun-like. And all the sun-like stars in the volume of space on the map are in the pattern. Terence Dickinson went so far as to say, if we were astronomers and we lived on Zeta Reticuli 2, that is seen from the southern hemisphere in the constellation the Net, or Zeta Reticuli, this would be a logical travel route to go to our sun, which is up here, and to visit our planets. So he thought that all of this seemed perfectly logical. There were disinformants and paid skeptics as well, who said that Betty could have done this by throwing marbles into a sand pile, but Marjorie couldn't find a match, and no one else has found a match that had these kinds of properties. There were also chemical analyses done on Betty's dress. I think at this point there have been 6 or 8 chemical analyses and 2 DNA analyses. So in 1977, the University of Cincinnati Chemistry Department did one, and that the powder was strange in relationship to the inorganic elemental compound. They said it was high in organic hydrocarbons. In the year 2000, the Pinelandia Biophysics Laboratory did a bioassay test growing seedlings. And they did that by using Petri dishes, and they had samples of Betty's dress, one with the pink powder on it, one with the blue that had not been, had powder on it, and then plain water. And what they said is that the chemical analysis the seedlings developed at an unusually fast rate, and that this was highly unusual. We saw this also by the tree in the Travis Walton abduction, that the tree grew at an extraordinarily fast rate after that, as evidenced by the rings inside that tree that have been taken out as samples. And the chemical analysis that was done by MUFON's own Phyllis Budinger from Frontier Analysis Laboratory revealed that the chemical analysis supports Betty's account of the event. And her full report is on John Greenwald's Black Vault website, and I wrote about it as well, but not all of the details, because I had limited number of words that I could put into this book. I started out with 120 and had to 120,000. I had to condense it down to 90,000. So I had to leave out a lot. There was an alien symbols study done. It was done after Betty sketched the symbols for me. I kept them in my locked file cabinet and didn't take them out until I wrote Captured. And they're published in Captured. Dr. Don C. Donderi, who is on the ERT as a research scientist, was a psychologist, research psychologist at McGill University in Montreal. And he has had a long-term interest in UFOs. And he did a study in 2004, and then a second study, I believe it was in 2005, with Stuart Appel from the State University of New York at Brockport, and with Bud Hopkins. And Bud Hopkins had been collecting symbols since the mid-1970s. Don Donderi compared Betty's symbols to the symbols in the study. And you'll read more about that study in my book, the new book. But Don said, the symbols Betty remembered and that were published for the first time in 2007 look remarkably like many of the symbols that Hopkins had been collecting from abductees since 1975. There's much more to the story. It's all in the books. But Betty was encouraged by a team of scientists to do an experiment with them to attempt to call in UFOs. And she did. They scripted her. They gave her the words to say. She went out to her back porch and tried to pass these messages night after night after night to these aliens who were inside these craft. And then she would go to places to try to take photos or to look for them. She asked these craft to land on my grandparents' farm. And twice they were observed landing on my grandparents' farm. One landed 200 feet from my childhood home, was observed by 2 people and left physical trace evidence on the ground. So this is one of Betty's photographs that was enlarged of a craft that she saw. You can see here, there's one window here, and on the original slide, I could see an entity standing here. You can't really see its head here, I don't think, or not closely, but this was its shoulders here. And then I don't know if this is a light or a window. Here's another one of her photographs of a fiery orb that she saw. The state of New Hampshire erected a historical marker to commemorate Betty's and Barney's event. And I had worked hard on that. It was a New Hampshire man named Mike Stevens who first came up with the idea. He contacted me and we contacted the state together, and then the state got back in touch with me, and I needed to present a couple of dozen documents to them proving that this incident really did occur. And so I did that for them. And I suggested the wording on the marker. So it says, on the night of September 19 through 20th, 1961, Portsmouth, New Hampshire couple Betty and Barney Hill experienced a close encounter with an unidentified object and 2 hours of lost time while driving south on Route 3 near Lincoln. They filed an official Air Force Project Blue Book report of a brightly lit cigar-shaped craft the next day, but were not public with their story until it was leaked to the Boston Traveler in 1965, or in the Boston Traveler. This was the first widely reported UFO abduction report in the United States. And it was the first scientifically investigated abduction report in the United States. Stanton and I did a conference up there in 2011, just after that was erected. And we did lectures and we gave a bus tour to the attendees. We had 2 buses full of people who went along, and I played some of the hypnosis tapes, and it was a lot of fun. There's the marker, and you can see one of the original cabins right there. Here Stan and I are when he passed in 2019 on May 13th. We wrote 3 books together. This is the new book, which Rich Dolan said is the definitive work on the most important UFO abduction case of the 20th century. And these are my other books. The new book is available and online through bookstores in many formats, as are my other books. But I've discovered that it's also being sold through Walmart and Target. So that was pretty exciting news to hear that. It's autographed copies are available on my website as well. The new book has been released. So thank you for listening, and I will answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Kathy. We have some questions in the Q&A down there on the left-hand corner. If you'll click on that, you can see questions that come in.
Okay.
And if anybody would like to ask a question, just click on that Q&A button, and hopefully you'll be able to put a question in there.
Yeah, I see it there. And the first question was, did the beings say how long their trip from their home planet to Zeta Reticuli, in Zeta Reticuli to Earth took? No, they didn't even tell Betty that they were from Zeta Reticuli. The leader showed Betty the map. He said to her, do you know where you are on this map? And she said, no, I don't know anything about the universe, is what she said. And he said, well, if you don't know where you are, how can I tell you where I am? And that was it. So she didn't know, they did not tell her. What did Barney die of? In 1969, he had a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He and Betty were home from work that day. It was February 25th of 1969. And it was the first day that they'd ever been home from work together. You can remember, he worked for the post office. It was even too bad to deliver the mail that day. They were down in their basement playing pool together, having a great time, when suddenly he felt like a bee sting in his temple. And then he didn't feel well, and he crawled up the stairs, and Betty saw that he fell at the top of the stairs, and she went up after him and tried to get him up on the couch. And she called the ambulance. The ambulance came, and he was still conscious. They were joking around with him, and he was taken to the hospital, and he died from a cerebral hemorrhage that evening. Really very, very sad for the family and for Betty too. I moved in with Betty after that. I was in college at the time, and she owned an apartment building. That yellow house you saw was her apartment building. She lived on the first floor. She had an empty apartment in the basement where that pool table was, but I moved into that basement apartment. It was set up as a regular apartment, and lived with her for a while. There was another reason too. Her house was being broken into, and the psychological operation was being pulled on her to try to make her go over the edge. I'm convinced of that at this point. They did terrible things. Let me give you an example of one that I witnessed for myself. I was downstairs studying. I heard what I thought was Betty come in through the door, and so we kept the doors between our apartments unlocked. I went up to greet her, thinking, well, maybe she'd come home for lunch, because it was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. She wasn't there, and I thought, oh, well, maybe she just dropped in to pick something up and had left. So I went back downstairs, and when I was down there, all of a sudden, I heard a loud crash, bang, running, and I went dashing up the stairs. What I saw was the closet door open, and Betty's baseball bat that she kept in that closet was on the floor. That's what the bang was. The front door to her apartment was open, the front door to the apartment house, and the front gate was open. I dashed out, and I saw a man dressed in a taupe-colored suit running up the street. That wasn't a burglar. Other things happened that were just meant to send her over the edge. Her tax documents were stolen just before she took them to her accountant. And they were delivered back to her at a later time, but in their delivery, they were scattered all over the floor in a trail through her apartment. The living room chairs were arranged in a circle in her living room, her dining room chairs. There were so many weird things that were done. Finally, she had one of the original security systems wired up in her house that was wired to the police department. And that was the only thing that stopped it. So please ask Q&A questions at the bottom left. Okay. Next one is, with the Shag Harbor incidents only 6 years later and almost due east, was there ever a connection made to the hills? Well, maybe. Betty and Barney were on a cruise up to Nova Scotia when they saw a lighted object out under the water. And it was very strange. They wondered if it was a craft. And, so it might have something to do there. I suspect that they just have a base there. When you look at the places where abductions occur on a frequent basis over many, many years, what I found is that there are many around deep bodies of water, around the Great Lakes, along the Atlantic, along the Pacific. So that's what I think might be the case. The question that every abductee certainly asks and ponders is, why me? Did Betty and Barney come to any conclusions or thoughts on this as it was related to their own experience? They did. And what they always said was that they believed that they just happened to be on the road in the off season with hardly any other vehicles around. They had stopped, they'd shown an interest in this craft, and this craft decided to show interest in them. From what I know now, from all of my years of working with experiencers, I think that Betty was probably a lifelong abductee. And the reason I believe that is because my mother was taken. We always kept the family connection secret, confidential, because of the huge problem it had presented to Betty and Barney with living their lives just being harassed and ridiculed and being cast in a different light from who they really were. I showed you who they were. These disinformants said that Betty was a kook who had a lifelong interest in UFOs and science fiction fan on top of that. That's all nonsense. It's not true. And they, as I told you, they said Barney was so weak that he would have believed anything Betty said. Not true. I think that, Betty was probably a lifelong experiencer. I know that my grandmother saw a craft behind her house. Dr. James Harder from APRO worked with the family. He hypnotized those of us who had conscious recall of UFO abduction, and I was one of them. My mother was one of them. I'm not sure if he hypnotized my grandmother or not, but I wouldn't be surprised if she was as well, especially due to her Native American and English heritage. My grandfather was from Ireland, so he had Celtic heritage. So I think that's the end of the questions.
Okay, well, I appreciate you coming in and doing this fantastic presentation for us, Kathy. I think
Thank
it's
you
the
so
best
much.
I've ever seen
Oh, thank you.
you know. So thank you so much.
I keep working on it, Margie.
Oh yeah, it's extremely detailed. I can't believe how many extra pieces of information are in here since I've seen your presentation some time ago. And of course, I read the first book, but now with the additions, I'm going to go out and get the new one. So how can people get a hold of your book?
Yeah, they can go to my website if they want an autographed copy. It's Kathleen-Marden.com, Kathleen with a K, Marden, M-A-R-D-E-N. You can order it from me through PayPal, or you can just order it in any format through Barnes & Noble, Amazon, any of those online book sellers. Or I'm not sure if it's in Walmart yet or if it's in Target yet. They're selling it online. I know that.
Okay, well, we'll put that on our website as well. And thank you so much. And good night to you. And good night to
thank
everybody.
you
Very much. Thank you for listening,
Thank you,
everybody.
Kathy. Phenomenal. Thank you so much.
Thank
That
you
was
very
great.
much.
See everybody next time.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.